human beings must constantly make decisions. Every rational decision process is made of 4 parts: identifying the options, analyzing the data, deciding which way to follow, and finally, living with yourself after the decision is made. To make better decisions, use the RAP process: widen your options, reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, and finally prepare to be wrong once you have decided. There are 5 ways to widen your options. The first one consists in checking if a this, or that decision can be turned into a this, and that decision, much like Carl Sagan, was not a professor of astronomy or brilliant writer. In fact, he was an incredible professor and writer. The second consists in thinking constantly about the opportunity cost. Imagine, for instance, that, instead of buying an Eric Clapton DVD that costs $76, you could buy 3 good DVDs that are less expensive. Another way to avoid having a narrow view is to do much like big companies do, when they hire a decision advisor from KPMG or other companies to help them analyze a given market and make a good decision. If you do not have a decision advisor, you can try to think like one. The fourth technique is to try the vanishing options test. The idea here is to imagine that the magic genie from the bottle has an eccentric brother who, instead of granting 3 wishes to a person, arbitrarily takes options away. In other words, try to imagine how to proceed if you did not have any of the options you think you have. If you had to keep that bad employee, what would you do? The fifth way to multiply your options is to search for existing solutions. In this way, you avoid to waste too much time with things that do not matter and focus on things that actually matter. There are 3 ways to find existing solutions. The first one is to search for people that have already solved the problem you need to address. This can be achieved by looking at your own bright spots. In other words, you can study the situations in which you were able to solve this problem. If some of your workers are able to do their work faster, it is important to understand how they achieve that. You may also try to find answers outside your life experience. A great example of searching for solutions outside is Walmart. This company became very successful because of its effective benchmarking. The second way someone may effectively use prior solutions is by using the so-called decision playlist. Suppose, for example, that your company needs to cut expenses. A list of ready-made questions and issues, based on previous bright spots, could help direct the budget cutter. In this case, this list could contain questions such as, could you cut deeper than you need to in order to free up funds to invest in exciting new opportunities? It could also contain statements that might be useful such as, resist the urge to cut everything by a fixed amount. The third way to use existing solutions is to try to make analogies. A great example of an accomplishment only possible because of analogies is the creation of a swimsuit that was inspired by the texture of the shark's skin. This technology created swimsuits that were so fast that they were banned from competitions. If the analogy were to be made with the feathers of birds, the swimsuit would not probably work because birds do not swim. In this case, the shark skin can be considered a close analogy. The bird feather can be considered as the distant analogy. The close analogy presents lower risks and novelty than the distant analogy. It is important to remember that finding someone that has solved one problem is much easier than creating a decision playlist. It is also clear that creating a decision playlist is easier than creating analogies because, in order to do so, you need to think out of the box instead of just enumerating your bright spots. Once someone has many options to analyze, he has to be able to reality test his assumptions about these alternatives. The first way to do so is to spark constructive disagreement. Instead of simply criticizing your colleagues' ideas, ask them the question, what would have to be true for this option to be the very best choice? Your co-worker will probably stop defending his ideas so as to try to save his job, and will start thinking about how to make such alternative viable. Another intelligent way to reality test your assumptions is to ask disconfirming questions. Suppose a store has an iPad, and it has a freezing problem. If you ask the seller to tell you about the product, only 8% will spontaneously explain to you that this problem exists. However, if you ask him, what problems does it have? 89% of them will tell you about this inconvenience. In this case, you obtain valuable information by using questions that disconfirm the information given, because the seller knows that someone who asks a question like this one is probably well informed and, therefore, not very easily convinced by lies. The practice of asking such questions can backfire, in some cases. The extended version of this video explains when this might happen. The third technique to avoid the confirmation bias is the so-called extreme disconfirmation. It consists in forcing ourselves to consider the opposite of our instincts. Sometimes we assume that someone does not value us, or is trying to undermine us. However, this happens quite often because we focus on the criticism or somebody's behavior in very specific moments. In this way, instead of thinking about all the bad things your wife does, you should try to balance them with the very good things she does for you daily. In this way, you have a better sense of who your wife is. By doing so, when she fails to meet some expectations of yours, you are less likely to imagine that she did so because she does not appreciate you. You may also try to assume positive intent at your work environment. The fourth way to challenge your assumptions consists in deliberately making a mistake. Suppose you have every reason to believe that people from some neighborhoods will never enjoy your product because they are too sophisticated. You may intentionally go against this belief and offer your product to some people in these areas to see if you are right. If you fail, you confirm your assumption. If you succeed, you have a new set of assumptions. UCHI means running small experiments to test our theories. When you make a small experiment, you create a way to see if your basic assumptions work in reality, before putting your big idea into practice. One study has even shown that corporate executives favor prediction while entrepreneurs favor active testing. Notice that first three principles are very helpful to understand the facts about a given subject, but they are dealing with how to think. The last two principles, on the other hand, are practical. These 5 strategies can only be effectively used if you know how to proceed. That is, if you learn how to zoom out and then zoom in. Zooming out means being able to see your situation as an outside observer. Zooming in means seeing your situation with your own eyes. It means getting the data obtained by zooming out, and adapting it to your specific situation. In order to make your outside view more realistic, it is important to try to find some base rates, in other words, average numbers that may help you understand how things work for other people. Sometimes, such data is available on the internet, as a result of studies by reliable scientists. If you cannot find a lot of information about a given subject, you can ask experts to give you some numbers about your problem. Sometimes, they cannot give you exact numbers, but they can help you understand how likely some events are. Be careful, however, with experts' predictions about the future, as they are often wrong. Roosevelt is a good example of how one can zoom out, and then zoom in. He used the polls to acquire base rates about different subjects. That is, he zoomed out, and he analyzed the mail sent by citizens, to get in touch with what people were actually writing. That is, he zoomed in. Once you have analyzed your options, you must decide. In order to do so, you must avoid short-term emotions. This can be achieved by 3 methods. The first one is the 10-10-10 analysis, that forces us to consider our future emotions. How would you feel 10 minutes from now if you asked that girl out and she said yes? What about 10 months from now? What about 10 years from now? How would you feel in these same future moments, if she said no? Another technique to attain distance consists in looking at your situation from an observer's perspective. A businessman, for example, should ask himself, what would my successor do? Another interesting way to overcome short-term emotions is to think of yourself as an advice giver. In other words, what would you tell your best friend to do in this situation? Sometimes, short-term emotions are not the problem. Some people can successfully take some time to decide and avoid these emotions. However, they fail to decide correctly due to long-term emotions. In other words, they face conflicts among their core priorities. The solution to this problem involves 2 steps. The first one consists in identifying your core principles. A hospital that has the mission of providing the best service possible to their clients is likely to make better decisions than a hospital that has no clear mission. This mission allows their doctors and managers to decide between different options using very clear criteria. The second step consists in effectively putting your priorities first. There are 3 ways to achieve this goal. The first one is to make a list with your top priorities, the so-called list A. Then, you must make a list B with other activities that are important but are not priorities. It is important to understand that by deciding to focus on your priorities, you need to stop doing certain activities. In order to do so, a stop doing list is an interesting way to identify less important activities that occupy your time. Another important way to improve your focus on priorities is to have an hourly beep that reminds you that your time is passing and that you need to do the most important work first. Now that the decision has been made, you have to live with the results of this decision. In order to do so, you need to prepare yourself to be wrong. There are 2 important strategies that must be followed. The first one is setting tripwires. In life, we naturally slip into autopilot, leaving past decisions unquestioned. That strategy is especially useful when change is gradual because we tend to notice only radical changes. Their first kind of tripwire consists in setting deadlines. In this way, you establish that a given project must be finished in 6 months. This strategy makes you more aware of your progress. Besides, it forces you to consider any decisions that must be taken in the end of this period. The second technique consists in using partitions. You can organize your budget in order to spend $10,000 at most after 6 months, and $20,000 at most after 1 year. That strategy makes you aware of how much you are spending and forces you to consider, in the end of this period, if you need to change anything about your decision. It is important to keep in mind that many powerful tripwires are not triggered by dates or budget, but by patterns. A good example is a children's hospital that has decreased the number of dead patients by creating a team of doctors that would intervene whenever a nurse found that something was wrong with any given sick person. In this case, the tripwire was simply the feeling by the nurses that something was wrong. That seems very subjective, but it proved extremely useful in this case. The second strategy to prepare to be wrong is only used when working with groups. People might see the decision process as unfair, for example, if they feel like they are not being heard. In such cases, the group will probably resist changes that must be made to implement the decision. The only solution to this problem is bargaining. This process consists in trying to reach a point in which all sides agree with the choice. There are 2 important aspects of bargaining. The first is making people feel like they have been heard. The best way to do so is to state back the other side's position, better than they themselves could. By showing that you listen to them and that you know the value of their arguments, you make them less concerned about blindly defending their points. The second important aspect of bargaining is pointing out the flaws of the decision you have reached. In this way, the other members of the group know that you are not a blind leader who simply follows his own ideas. They realize that you acknowledge the flaws that they have pointed out concerning your idea. When you bargain, you usually take longer to make decisions, but you often implement them faster. This happens because your partners all agree that the process was just and that the decision was reached in a rational manner. When one thinks about the future, he has to understand that it is not a point, but a range of outcomes from very bad to very good. That is, we need to imagine that, in 1 year, our decision has failed. How could you have prevented failure? Notice that when we imagine that we have failed, instead of thinking about problems we might face after we have made a decision, we deal with the future in a more realistic way. The same idea should be used to think about success. Imagine that, 1 year from now, we have succeeded. What can we do to be completely prepared for the increase in demand for our product? We must prepare for what cannot be foreseen.